The avoidant spent the relationship unable to fully recognize or acknowledge that you embodied the exact qualities they consciously claimed to want in a partner and unconsciously needed for healing and wholeness. They stated they wanted someone understanding. You provided exceptional understanding of their defended psychology, recognizing patterns as protective responses rather than as character flaws. They claimed they wanted someone patient. You demonstrated extraordinary patience, tolerating withdrawal and inconsistency that would have driven most people away within weeks or months. They said they wanted someone who gave them space. You respected their need for defended distance, even when that distance harmed you and left your needs unmet. They expressed they wanted someone who would not pressure them. You adjusted your expectations downward, avoiding requests that would trigger their defended resistance. They indicated they wanted someone emotionally intelligent. You possessed sophisticated psychological understanding combined with empathic capacity to apply that understanding to their specific wounds and patterns. Beyond conscious stated preferences, you also embodied unconscious needs their defended psychology prevented them from articulating or even recognizing. You provided external access to an emotional world their defenses prevented them accessing internally. You gave them vicarious experience of feelings through your emotional expressiveness. You helped them understand their own suppressed internal states through your perceptive naming of what they could not identify themselves. You mirrored disowned, vulnerable parts they rejected in themselves. You represented the emotional, authentic self they had to split off during defended development. You embodied the capacity for feeling and connection they learned was too dangerous to maintain in themselves. You offered a safe relationship context where their defended patterns were understood rather than condemned. You created an environment where withdrawal was met with patience rather than rejection, where emotional unavailability was met with compassion rather than judgment, where their wounded, defended self could exist without facing the constant criticism or abandonment they learned to expect. You were literally everything they ever wanted and needed. You met every conscious criterion they articulated for an ideal partner. You fulfilled unconscious needs their psychology required for potential healing and integration. You provided exactly the understanding and patience and space their defended structure needed to feel safe enough that growth might have become possible. Yet despite being everything they wanted and needed, despite providing ideal conditions for a relationship and for their potential healing, the avoidance defended patterns prevented them from sustaining a relationship with you. They could not tolerate the intimacy that receiving what you offered required. They could not maintain the vulnerability that being truly known by you created. They could not reciprocate adequately despite you meeting their every stated preference. They could not do the therapeutic work that would have allowed them to integrate what you represented and to build a sustainable partnership with the person who embodied everything they needed. The relationship ended through their patterns making it unsustainable. It ended because their defended limitations prevented them from maintaining a partnership with the ideal person. It ended because they could not tolerate intimacy with someone who saw and accepted them completely. It ended because withdrawal patterns eventually exceeded your capacity to tolerate despite your exceptional patience. Now they face the devastating recognition that they lost everything they ever wanted and needed, that they destroyed a relationship with a person who was an ideal match for both conscious preferences and unconscious needs, that their defended patterns cost them their best and possibly only chance at a relationship with someone who could have supported their healing while meeting every criterion they claimed was important in a partner. This recognition creates a profound crisis because it forces facing that their patterns are the problem preventing them from having what they want, that they are fundamentally unable to sustain a relationship with an ideal partner due to defended limitations, that they may spend the rest of their life seeking what they already had and lost through their inability to reciprocate adequately or to do the work that would have developed the capacity to sustain a partnership with everything they ever wanted embodied in you. You met every criterion they claimed mattered, yet they couldn't handle actually receiving it. The avoidant articulated specific preferences throughout their relational history and throughout the relationship with you, preferences for an understanding, patient partner who would give them space without pressure, while possessing the emotional intelligence to comprehend their internal experience. These stated preferences felt genuine because they reflected real needs of their defended psychology. They genuinely needed understanding because their patterns are difficult to comprehend without psychological knowledge. They genuinely needed patience because their defended limitations meant progress toward intimacy would be slow and inconsistent. They genuinely needed space because closeness triggered defensive withdrawal. They genuinely needed an absence of pressure because expectations activated defended resistance. They genuinely needed emotional intelligence because their own emotional awareness was limited, requiring a partner who could help them make sense of an internal experience they could not interpret independently. You embodied every single stated preference with exceptional fidelity. Your understanding of defended psychology exceeded basic comprehension, reaching sophisticated, accurate perception of how their attachment wounds created current patterns, how their withdrawal served a protective function, how their emotional unavailability reflected suppression rather than absence of feeling. Your patience exceeded normal relationship tolerance, extending across months or years of patterns that would have ended most relationships within weeks, maintaining hope and commitment when evidence of reciprocation remained minimal or absent. Your respect for their space honored their need for distance, even when honoring that need meant accepting long periods of minimal contact, meant tolerating uncertainty about relationship status, meant suppressing your own legitimate needs for consistent presence and connection. Your absence of pressure manifested through adjusting your expectations downward to match their limited capacity, through avoiding requests that would trigger resistance, through accepting whatever minimal effort they provided rather than demanding adequate reciprocation. Your emotional intelligence particularly distinguished you as an exceptional match for their stated preferences. You possess not just general emotional awareness, but specific knowledge about avoidant attachment, about defended psychology, about how childhood wounds create adult relational patterns. You could read their internal states with unusual accuracy. You could perceive when withdrawal reflected overwhelm versus when it reflected deactivation, could distinguish defensive shutdown from genuine need for space, could recognize their minimal communications, carried emotional content their words did not explicitly convey. You provided what their stated preferences indicated they needed. You provided an understanding partner who comprehended their defended complexity, a patient partner who tolerated their patterns without immediate abandonment, a spacious partner who did not crowd their defended autonomy, an unpressuring partner who accepted their limitations, an emotionally intelligent partner who helped them make sense of themselves. Yet, despite meeting every criterion they claimed was important, despite embodying the ideal partner based on their stated preferences, the avoidant could not handle actually receiving what they said they wanted. The understanding you provided felt threatening because being understood meant being seen beneath defenses. It meant you perceived the wounded self they worked to hide. It meant they could not maintain the defended false presentation that protected them from vulnerability. The patience you demonstrated felt uncomfortable because it highlighted their inadequacy. Your continued tolerance, despite their patterns, made obvious how poorly they were reciprocating, creating guilt and shame about failing to meet your needs despite your exceptional accommodation of theirs. The space you provided felt lonely because too much space revealed the emptiness of their defended existence. When you honored their distance, they experienced the isolation their defenses created, rather than experiencing your presence that usually buffered them from the full experience of defended loneliness. The absence of pressure you maintained created a different discomfort because it removed an external structure they unconsciously relied upon. Many avoidants claim they want no pressure, yet unconsciously need a partner's expectations to provide motivation and direction. Without pressure, they lack external impetus to engage or reciprocate. They find themselves adrift without the structure that a partner's needs and expectations usually provide. Your acceptance of their limitations without demands paradoxically made engaging optional rather than necessary. It removed the urgency that expectations create, leaving them without the external push they unconsciously needed, despite consciously claiming they wanted an absence of pressure. Your emotional intelligence felt exposing because you understood too much. You saw through their defended explanations, recognized their patterns before they could fully execute them, comprehended their internal experience in ways that made hiding impossible. The fundamental problem was that their stated preferences reflected what their defended psychology needed to feel safe. Yet, actually receiving what makes them feel safe creates an intimacy that threatens the defensive structure those preferences were designed to protect. They wanted understanding so they would not be rejected for their patterns. Yet being understood meant being vulnerable and known in ways defenses resist. They wanted patience so they would not be abandoned during their defended withdrawal. Yet patience meant the relationship persisted, creating increasing intimacy their defenses needed to escape. They wanted space so they could maintain defended autonomy. Yet when you honored space, they experienced the loneliness that space creates when no one pursues to close the distance. They wanted no pressure so they could engage at their comfortable pace. Yet absence of pressure meant no external motivation to overcome defensive resistance to intimacy. They wanted emotional intelligence so a partner could help them understand themselves. Yet being helped to understand themselves meant facing wounds and needs their defenses existed to suppress. The inability to handle receiving what they claimed they wanted reveals that stated preferences served a defensive function rather than reflecting genuine readiness for intimate relationship. The preferences described ideal conditions for their defended comfort, conditions that would allow them to remain defended while accessing relationship benefits, that would let them maintain emotional control while receiving emotional support, that would permit staying disconnected while feeling understood. Yet, genuine intimate relationship requires more than defended comfort. It requires reciprocal vulnerability. It requires tolerating discomfort intimacy creates. It requires engaging even when engagement exceeds comfortable defended limits. You provided everything they said they wanted, which should have created an ideal relationship. Instead, your provision of ideal conditions exposed that they could not sustain intimacy even under ideal circumstances, that their defended limitations prevented relationship regardless of how perfectly a partner met their stated needs. Understanding that you met every criterion, yet they could not handle receiving it, allows recognition of the profound tragedy in their loss. They lost a partner who embodied everything they claimed was important. They lost not because you failed to provide what they said they needed, but because actually receiving what they needed created an intimacy their defenses could not tolerate. They spent the relationship unable to fully engage with the ideal partner, unable not because you were inadequate, but because their defended structure prevented engagement regardless of your adequacy. They now face that their patterns cost them the person who met every stated criterion. They face that the problem was never your failure to be what they needed, but was always their inability to sustain a relationship with someone who provided exactly what they claimed to want. This recognition should theoretically motivate therapeutic work to address the defenses preventing them from having what they want. Yet most avoidants respond to this recognition with regret and obsession rather than with a commitment to change work. They remain stuck, grieving the loss of the ideal partner while maintaining the defended patterns that made losing the ideal partner inevitable, given their inability to handle actually receiving everything they ever claimed they wanted in a relationship. Their defenses rejected the exact healing you offered because healing requires a vulnerability they refuse. The avoidance defended patterns stem from attachment wounds created during childhood, when emotional expression led to rejection or dismissal, when vulnerability resulted in abandonment or punishment, when needs for comfort or connection were met with inconsistency or unavailability. These wounds taught them that emotions are dangerous to express, that vulnerability leads to harm, that needs will not be met and should be suppressed. the wounded child developed a defensive structure to protect against repeating these painful experiences, a pattern of suppressing emotion to avoid rejection, of avoiding vulnerability to prevent abandonment, of denying needs to escape the disappointment that expressing needs would create. This defensive structure served an adaptive function in the childhood environment where it protected the child from additional pain. Yet the structure persists into adulthood, where it prevents the intimate relationships and emotional healing the adult consciously desires, even while defenses unconsciously resist. You entered their life offering the exact conditions necessary for healing these attachment wounds. You provided consistent emotional availability that contradicted their learned belief that emotional expression leads to rejection. You remained present and accepting when they expressed whatever limited emotion their defenses allowed, demonstrating that sharing feelings creates connection rather than creating the rejection they learned to expect. You offered a safe environment for vulnerability that contradicted their learned belief that vulnerability results in abandonment. When they showed wounded parts of themselves, you responded with compassion and continued presence, rather than with the judgment or abandonment their childhood taught them vulnerability generates. You demonstrated patience with their defended limitations that contradicted their learned belief they must be independent and need-free to be acceptable. You accepted them, including their defended patterns, rather than demanding they immediately transform to meet your needs. Your understanding of their psychology specifically created conditions for healing because you recognize their patterns as protective responses to wounds rather than as fixed character flaws requiring condemnation. This recognition meant you could hold space for both their defended presentation and their wounded, authentic self. You could see the hurt child beneath the defended adult. You could comprehend why they developed patterns, even while those patterns harmed the relationship. You could maintain compassion for the wounds while still experiencing hurt from the patterns those wounds created. This dual holding of understanding origins while acknowledging impact created precisely the therapeutic relational environment where attachment wounds can heal within, an environment where wounded parts are seen and accepted, where defenses are understood rather than attacked, where the person experiences being valued despite patterns, where healing can occur through experiencing that vulnerability and emotional expression lead to connection rather than to the rejection and abandonment that created the wounds originally. Yet, the same defenses that were created to protect against attachment wounds also prevented them from receiving the healing that relationship with you offered. Healing attachment wounds requires vulnerability. It requires allowing wounded parts to be seen. It requires expressing suppressed emotions. It requires acknowledging needs that defenses were built to deny. This vulnerability feels impossibly threatening to the defensive system because vulnerability is precisely what defenses exist to prevent. The child learned vulnerability leads to pain. Defenses developed to eliminate vulnerability, ensuring pain would not repeat. Your offer of a safe space for vulnerability threatened the defensive structure because if vulnerability is actually safe with you, then defenses might be unnecessary. Yet defenses cannot risk discovering they are unnecessary because the defensive structure has become a core part of identity and psychological functioning. Letting down defenses, even in a demonstrably safe environment, feels like risking annihilation because defenses feel essential to survival, even when they are actually preventing healing and preventing the intimate connection the adult self desires. Your provision of healing conditions therefore created a profound internal conflict between their conscious desire for healing and intimate relationship versus their unconscious, defended resistance to the vulnerability healing would require. Consciously, they wanted to heal wounds, wanted to overcome patterns, wanted to build an intimate relationship, wanted to access an emotional world their defenses prevented them experiencing. Yet unconsciously, their defenses resisted the vulnerability necessary for healing. They resisted being seen in a wounded state, resisted expressing suppressed emotions, resisted acknowledging needs, resisted letting you close enough that healing could occur. This internal conflict manifested through a push-pull pattern where they moved toward you, drawn by the conscious desire for healing and intimacy, then withdrew when proximity activated the defended fear of vulnerability that healing requires. The rejection of the healing you offered particularly manifested through their defending against your understanding and your compassion. You saw their wounded self beneath the defended presentation. This seeing should have felt relieving because being truly known addresses a profound loneliness. Yet being seen triggered defended shame because you witnessed parts they learned were unacceptable. You saw needs they were taught to suppress. You perceived a vulnerability they were trained to hide. Your compassion for their wounds should have felt healing. It should have corrected the childhood message that wounds make them unacceptable. Yet compassion felt threatening because accepting compassion would require acknowledging wounds exist, would mean admitting they have needs, would necessitate receiving care that defenses were built to make unnecessary. They defended against your healing offerings through minimizing your understanding, claiming you did not really understand them when understanding felt too exposing. Through rejecting your compassion, interpreting care as pity or as an attempt to control rather than accepting the offered healing. Through maintaining a defended presentation even when you demonstrated that seeing beneath the presentation was safe. The defended rejection of healing also operated through their inability to trust that the safety you provided was genuine and sustainable. Childhood taught them that parental safety is temporary. A caregiver who seemed available would become unavailable. A moment of connection would be followed by rejection. Expression of need would sometimes be met and sometimes be punished, creating an unpredictable environment where safety could not be relied upon. This learned distrust of safety meant they could not fully accept the healing conditions you offered because defenses anticipated safety would eventually prove false. They anticipated you would eventually reject them as childhood figures rejected them. They anticipated your compassion would turn to judgment. They anticipated your patience would reach limits, resulting in abandonment. They learned to expect it. The defended anticipation of eventual betrayal prevented them from risking vulnerability even in a genuinely safe environment because defenses could not distinguish the current safe relationship from past unsafe relationships that created their wounds. Understanding that their defenses rejected the healing you offered allows recognition of a profound tragedy beyond losing an ideal partner. You are not just the person who met their stated preferences. You were the person who offered a genuine opportunity for healing the attachment wounds that create their defended patterns and prevent intimate relationships. You provided a safe relational environment where vulnerability would have been met with acceptance, where emotional expression would have created connection, where needs would have been responded to with care. This environment was precisely what their wounded child needed to heal. They needed to experience that vulnerability is safe, that emotions create intimacy rather than rejection, that needs can be expressed and met. Yet the same defenses created to protect the wounded child also prevented the adult from accepting the healing you offered. They prevented them from risking vulnerability even in a safe environment. They prevented them from receiving the compassion their wounds desperately needed. They prevented them from building an intimate relationship where healing could have occurred through experiencing the opposite of what childhood taught them about emotional expression, vulnerability, and needs. They lost not just a partner who embodied everything they wanted. They lost the opportunity for healing that relationship with you represented. They lost the chance to correct childhood wounds through experiencing a safe, intimate relationship. They lost the possibility of integration and wholeness that your mirroring of disowned parts offered. They lost the therapeutic relationship context where their patterns could have been gradually transformed through experiencing that vulnerability leads to connection rather than to rejection. That needs can be expressed and met rather than requiring suppression. That intimate relationship can be safe rather than inevitably resulting in the abandonment their wounds taught them to expect. This loss is catastrophic beyond losing a valuable partner. It represents losing their best or only opportunity to heal wounds that create patterns, preventing them from sustaining any intimate relationship. It represents losing the chance to transform a defended existence into an integrated, authentic life where the emotional world is accessible and intimate connection is possible. Yet recognizing this catastrophic loss does not typically motivate therapeutic work. Instead, it generates defended grief and regret that keeps them stuck, mourning what they lost while maintaining the defended patterns that made them unable to receive the healing you offered, ensuring they will likely repeat a similar pattern in future relationships where they are drawn to healing partners, yet defend against vulnerability, losing relationship after relationship while wounds remain unhealed and defenses remain intact, preventing them from ever receiving the healing they consciously want, yet unconsciously resist. They'll search forever for another you while staying exactly the same person who lost you. The avoidant faces recognition through failed replacement attempts that you embodied the ideal partner for their conscious preferences and unconscious needs. You embodied the understanding, patient, emotionally intelligent person who gave them the space they claimed to want. You embodied the emotional access and vulnerable mirroring they unconsciously needed. You embodied the healing relationship context their wounds required for potential recovery. This recognition that you were everything they wanted and needed creates a specific response pattern where they become fixated on finding another person like you, another partner who understands defended psychology as you understood it, who demonstrates the patience you demonstrated, who provides the emotional access you provided, who offers the healing context you created. They search for a replacement you, believing that finding a similar partner will allow them to have the relationship they could not sustain with you, will give them a second chance to receive what they were unable to receive from you, will recreate the ideal conditions they did not appreciate adequately when you provided them. Yet the search for another you operates from a fundamentally flawed premise, that the problem was losing you specifically, rather than the problem being their defended incapacity to sustain an intimate relationship with an ideal partner. They frame the loss as, I lost the perfect person, when an accurate framing would be, my defended patterns prevented me from sustaining a relationship with the perfect person. The distinction is critical because the first framing suggests finding another perfect person solves the problem, while the second framing reveals that finding a similar person recreates the same problem unless defended patterns are addressed. They search for a replacement you, believing another understanding, patient partner will work out differently, believing they will appreciate the second version more than they appreciated you, that they will reciprocate better with the replacement than they reciprocated with you, that they will sustain intimacy with the new person despite being unable to sustain intimacy with you. This search for a replacement you serves a defensive function by avoiding the recognition that they need to change, rather than needing to find a different or better version of the ideal partner they already had. Searching for another you allows them to remain focused externally, focused on finding the right person rather than examining internally their defended limitations that prevented sustaining a relationship with the right person when they had you. Searching maintains hope they can have what they want without doing therapeutic work. It maintains the belief that a perfect match exists who will somehow bypass their defended resistance in ways you did not bypass it, who will make intimacy comfortable enough that defenses will not activate, who will meet their needs without triggering the defensive withdrawal you could not prevent despite meeting needs exceptionally well. Searching for another, you protects them from facing that they need fundamental change in defensive structure, rather than needing to find a better partner than the partner who was already ideal for them. The search inevitably fails because they remain exactly the same defended person who lost you. They search while maintaining identical defended patterns that made the relationship with you unsustainable. They seek a new ideal partner while possessing the same limited capacity for intimacy that prevented reciprocating adequately with you. They hope for a different outcome while doing nothing to create the capacity for a different outcome through therapeutic work addressing defended limitations.